No one in NASCAR was ready for the silence that followed Kyle Busch's final days. For more than 2 decades, fans knew him as the driver who never entered a track quietly, never raced like he was asking permission, and never seemed built for an ending this sudden. He was loud, fearless, polarizing, brilliant, and impossible to ignore. To some, he was the villain NASCAR needed. To others, he was the last true racer of an older, harder generation. But when the news broke that Kyle Busch had died at just 41, the sport did not react like it had lost only a driver. It reacted like an entire era had been ripped away without warning. Official reports later said he had been dealing with pneumonia symptoms for days to weeks before the illness worsened, leading to sepsis and fatal complications. He became unresponsive while using a racing simulator in Concord, North Carolina, and died the next day in Charlotte. What made the shock even harder to process was that Kyle Busch did not look like a man standing at the edge of his final chapter. He was still active, still competitive, still tied to Richard Childress Racing, still part of the weekly rhythm of NASCAR life. NASCAR's own profile remembered him as a full-time Cup Series driver for RCR, a 2-time Cup champion, and one of the most accomplished winners the sport had ever seen. That is why the word final feels so brutal here. There was no farewell tour, no final lap under prepared applause, no carefully staged goodbye. Just a man who had spent his life controlling machines at impossible speed, suddenly losing control of something far more fragile, the human body. For years, Kyle Busch made people feel something. That was his power. You did not have to like him to watch him. You did not have to cheer for him to respect him. He could win and make half the grandstands angry. He could lose and still dominate the conversation. He carried the kind of competitive arrogance that only becomes tolerable when it is backed by results, and Kyle backed it up again and again. The trophies, the records, the fire, the booze, the interviews, the confrontations, the comebacks, they all formed a public image so intense that many forgot there was a private person underneath it. A husband, a father, a man who coughed, hurt, pushed through discomfort, and perhaps believed, like so many competitors do, that toughness could outrun warning signs. That is the uncomfortable truth behind this story. Racing teaches drivers to ignore fear. It rewards pain tolerance. It turns pressure into routine. But illness does not care how many races you have won. Sepsis does not care how fearless you were at 200 miles per hour. Pneumonia does not care whether the crowd loved you or hated you. In the end, the same man who built a career by surviving chaos on the track was taken by something quiet, internal, and easy to underestimate until it was too late. And that is why Kyle Busch's final days feel less like a sports headline and more like a warning. Behind every legend is a body that can break. Behind every champion is a family that has to face the silence after the engines stop. Behind every public figure is a private countdown no one can see. The world was ready to argue about Kyle Busch for many more years. It was ready to debate his legacy, his attitude, his talent, his place among NASCAR's greatest names. But it was not ready to say goodbye. So this is not just the story of how Kyle Busch died. It is the story of how a man who lived in noise left behind a silence so heavy that even NASCAR did not know how to fill it. Before the final shock, there was the legend. Kyle Busch was never simply another driver in NASCAR. He was the kind of figure who made the sport feel dangerous even before the green flag dropped. Long before the headlines turned tragic, long before fans began asking what really happened in his final days, Kyle had already built a career that seemed too large for one lifetime. He was a 2-time NASCAR Cup Series champion, winning the title in 2015 and again in 2019, and by the time of his death, he held 63 Cup Series victories and 234 wins across NASCAR's 3 national divisions, more than any driver in the sport's National Series history. But numbers alone never explain Kyle Busch. Records can tell you what he achieved. They cannot explain why people could not look away. Kyle raced like conflict was part of the engine. Every overtake felt personal. Every restart carried tension. Every interview had the possibility of turning into a headline. He was not the polished, harmless superstar built for comfortable sponsor rooms. He was sharp-edged, impatient, emotional, and brutally competitive. Fans booed him because he gave him a reason. Fans loved him because he gave them something real. In a sport increasingly shaped by branding, diplomacy, and carefully managed personalities, Kyle Busch remained unpredictable. He could be arrogant. He could be funny. He could be furious. But he was rarely fake. That made him one of NASCAR's most valuable characters. Every great sport needs someone who refuses to soften himself for public approval. Kyle filled that role better than anyone. He did not merely win races. He changed the temperature of the room. When he climbed into the car, people expected something to happen. A pass, a crash, a radio outburst, a victory bow, a villain moment, a reminder that racing was not supposed to be polite. Even those who disliked him understood that NASCAR was more interesting when Kyle Busch was near the front. But behind that fire was a cost most fans never saw. To be Kyle Busch was to live under constant judgment. If he won, people said he was too cocky. If he lost, people celebrated his failure. If he showed emotion, he was immature. If he stayed quiet, people assumed something was wrong. His greatness became a cage. He was expected to perform, to provoke, to entertain, to carry the identity of rowdy, even when the man underneath may have needed room to breathe. That is what makes the final chapter so haunting. In hindsight, the public image of Kyle Busch was almost too strong. He looked indestructible because fans had watched him survive everything the sport threw at him. Rivalries, wrecks, team changes, criticism, winless stretches, and the brutal pressure of expectation. NASCAR confirmed he was still racing full-time for Richard Childress Racing at the time of his passing, which made the suddenness even harder to accept. This was not a retired champion fading from memory. This was a man still inside the arena. And yet, the truth nobody was ready for is that even legends can be quietly losing a battle no one in the grandstands can see. Reports later stated that Busch had been experiencing pneumonia symptoms for days to weeks before his condition worsened into sepsis and fatal complications. That detail changes the emotional weight of the story. It suggests a man still moving forward, still living inside the rhythm of competition, while something dangerous was building inside him. Not a dramatic crash, not a final lap disaster, not the kind of ending racing fans are trained to fear. Something slower, something medical, something private. For a driver like Kyle Busch, slowing down may have been the hardest thing to do. His entire life had rewarded endurance. Push harder, ignore discomfort, finish the race, show up again next week. That mentality builds champions, but it can also make warning signs feel like weakness. And in the world of elite competition, weakness is often hidden until it becomes impossible to hide. That is why part 2 of this story is not just about Kyle's greatness. It is about the dangerous myth surrounding greatness. Fans saw the trophies, the temper, the dominance, the controversy. They saw the driver who could bend a race to his will. But they did not see the fragile line between toughness and vulnerability. They did not see how quickly a body can turn against even the strongest public image. Kyle Busch spent his career proving he could beat rivals, pressure, criticism, and time on the track. But his final days forced NASCAR to confront something far more painful. A champion can spend his life outrunning everyone and still be caught by something no checkered flag can stop. The most disturbing part of Kyle Busch's final days is not only that he was gone so suddenly, but that the warning signs may have been there before anyone fully understood how serious they were. According to later reporting on his death certificate, Busch had been dealing with bacterial pneumonia for days to weeks before it developed into sepsis, a medical emergency that can cause organ failure and death. That detail turns the story from a simple tragedy into something more painful. A champion was still moving through life, still connected to racing, still close enough to the sport that people assumed the machine was running normally, while his body was quietly entering a crisis. For NASCAR fans, this is hard to accept because Kyle Busch never looked like a man who would fade quietly. His entire identity was built around resistance. He resisted pressure. He resisted criticism. He resisted being liked on anyone else's terms. When people booed him, he fed off it. When rivals challenged him, he answered with speed. When seasons became difficult, he still carried himself like a driver who believed the next restart could change everything. That is why the image of his final days feels so unnatural. Kyle Busch was supposed to be in a race car, not in a hospital room. He was supposed to be arguing with the track, the setup, the field, the officials, the media, not fighting an infection that no amount of talent could outdrive. The timeline makes it even more chilling. Reports said he had recently remained active in racing, including a Craftsman Truck Series win at Dover only days before his death. That single detail explains why the news landed with such force. This was not someone who had disappeared from the public eye for months. This was not a former champion already far removed from the garage. This was Kyle Busch, still present, still competing, still part of the living pulse of NASCAR. To the outside world, activity can look like health. But sometimes activity is only momentum. Sometimes a person keeps moving because stopping would mean admitting how bad things have become. That is where the tragedy becomes deeply human. Athletes are trained to normalize discomfort. Drivers especially exist in a world where pain, heat, dehydration, exhaustion, and stress are treated as part of the job. A cough can be ignored. Fatigue can be blamed on travel. Shortness of breath can be explained away as strain. A fever can be treated as something temporary. And for someone like Kyle Busch, whose career was built on intensity, it is easy to imagine how illness might have been pushed aside as just another obstacle. Not because he was careless, but because champions are often conditioned to believe they can endure anything. But infection does not negotiate with ego. Pneumonia is not a rival you can intimidate. Sepsis is not a car you can correct with steering input. Once the body begins overreacting to infection, the situation can change frighteningly fast. That is the cruel truth hidden beneath the headline. Kyle Busch spent years mastering split-second decisions at high speed, yet the danger that took him was not visible in a mirror, not waiting in turn 4, not coming from another driver's bumper. It was internal, quiet, progressive, and by the time the world understood the scale of it, the ending had already arrived. For his fans, the hardest question is not only how did this happen, it is how could this happen to him? Kyle had survived the kind of pressures that break careers. He had moved through different teams, changing competitive cycles, public criticism, and the burden of being one of the most watched drivers in the sport. NASCAR's own tribute remembered him as a generational talent, a two-time Cup Series champion, and one of the greatest drivers the sport had seen. That kind of resume creates an illusion. It makes people believe greatness offers protection. It does not. And then there is the family side, the part that makes the story heavier than statistics. Behind a number 8 car, behind the championships, behind the rowdy image, there was a husband and father whose final chapter did not belong to the crowd. Public grief belongs to fans, but private grief belongs to the people who love the man when the helmet was off. For them, Kyle was not a headline or debate topic. He was the person at the dinner table, the father watching his son's future, the husband whose absence would be felt in ordinary rooms long after the tributes ended. That is why Part 3 matters. It forces the audience to look past the drama of death and into the fragile warning underneath it. Kyle Busch's final days were not just about a sudden loss. They were about how quickly strength can become silence, how easily illness can hide behind routine, and how even the loudest figure in the garage can be suffering in a way no crowd can hear. The final hours of Kyle Busch's life did not look like the ending people imagined for a racing legend. There was no violent crash, no dramatic last-lap battle, no flames, no wreckage, no sound of metal against wall. Instead, the final danger came in a form that felt almost impossible to connect with a man who had spent his life inside controlled chaos. Reports said Busch was short of breath, overheating, and coughing up blood before he became unresponsive, and his death was later linked to complications from bacterial pneumonia that progressed into sepsis. For fans, that detail was almost harder to accept than any accident would have been, because it showed that the enemy was not on the track. It was already inside him. That is what made the story so haunting. Kyle Busch had built his career around visible danger. Everyone understood the risk of racing. Every fan knew that one bad angle, one late block, one mechanical failure, one wrong move at high speed could change everything. NASCAR history is filled with those reminders. But this was different. This was quieter. It did not announce itself with smoke or sparks. It came through symptoms that could be mistaken for exhaustion, stress, sickness, or just another thing a tough competitor might try to push through. And that is why the final chapter feels so cruel. The man who knew how to survive danger at 200 miles per hour was taken by a danger no spotter could warn him about. In those final hours, the public image of Kyle Busch collapsed into something painfully human. The nickname Rowdy could not protect him. The trophies could not protect him. The championships could not protect him. The statistics could not stand between him and the reality that the body has limits. For years, fans had watched him as if he were made of aggression and horsepower, a driver who could absorb hatred, pressure, failure, criticism, and still come back swinging. But illness strips away mythology. It does not care about reputation. It does not pause because someone is famous. It does not negotiate with legacy. And for NASCAR, that realization landed like a cold wave through the garage. Kyle Busch was not a distant memory. He was still active, still relevant, still part of the weekly conversation. NASCAR's tribute described him as a two-time Cup Series champion and one of the defining talents of his generation, a driver whose National Series win total stood at 234. That number matters, but not because it turns him into a statistic. It matters because it shows the scale of what disappeared. When someone with that much history is gone overnight, the sport does not simply lose a name. It loses a measuring stick. Every driver after Kyle Busch had been compared to him in some way. Could they win like him? Could they dominate the lower series like him? Could they handle booze like him? Could they turn controversy into fuel like him? Could they be hated and still respected? Kyle occupied a strange space in NASCAR, too great to dismiss, too combative to fully embrace, too important to ignore. His absence, therefore, created a silence bigger than grief. It created a vacuum. Who becomes the villain now? Who carries that old-school aggression? Who makes fans angry enough to care? But the emotional center of the story was not in the grandstands or the media rooms. It was with the people closest to him. Public mourning is loud, but private mourning is where the real damage lives. The world could replay highlights, share tributes, argue over legacy, and post old victory lane clips. His family had to face the empty chair, the unfinished plans, the ordinary routines suddenly broken. His son Brexton had not only lost a famous father, he had lost a man who was supposed to guide him through the same racing world that had made the Busch name legendary. That is where the number 8 becomes more than a number. Reports said Richard Childress Racing would hold the number 8 car aside until Brexton Busch could one day carry it forward. In racing, numbers are not just identifiers. They become emotional property. They hold memory. They carry victories, heartbreaks, rivalries, sponsors, families, and ghosts. For Kyle, the number 8 had become the symbol of his final competitive chapter. For Brexton, it may one day become a bridge between inheritance and burden. And that is the painful truth nobody was ready for. Kyle Busch's final days did not end his story cleanly. They left behind questions, grief, unfinished races, and a son standing in the shadow of a giant. NASCAR can honor him. Fans can remember him. Rivals can praise him. But the silence after Kyle Busch is not something the sport can easily fill, because drivers like him are not replaced. They are survived. After Kyle Busch was gone, the number 8 no longer looked like just a race car. It became a symbol of everything left unfinished. For Richard Childress Racing, the garage did not simply lose a driver. It lost the center of a chapter that was supposed to continue through the 2026 season. NASCAR listed Busch as racing full-time for RCR when he passed away on May 21st, 2026, after a severe illness, which made the loss feel even more abrupt because he was still an active part of the Cup Series field. There had been no planned goodbye, no final season marketed as a farewell, no emotional countdown toward retirement. One week, Kyle Busch was still part of the competitive landscape. The next, the sport was trying to understand how to move forward without him. For RCR, that question was not only emotional, it was operational. A NASCAR team is built around motion. Cars must be prepared, sponsors must be represented, crews must keep working, schedules must be met, and the season does not pause forever, even after tragedy. That is one of racing's harshest truths. The garage mourns, but the calendar keeps moving. Tires are mounted, engines are checked, haulers leave, the next track waits. And somewhere in the middle of all that, people who knew Kyle personally had to do their jobs while carrying the weight of his absence. But the deeper story was not only about who would drive next. It was about what Kyle Busch had meant to that organization. When he joined Richard Childress Racing, it was already a dramatic turn in his career. After years at Joe Gibbs Racing, where he won championships and became one of the defining faces of Toyota's NASCAR program, Busch moved into a Chevrolet at RCR and tried to write one more major chapter. That move carried risk. It also carried pride. Kyle was not content to become a fading legend living off old trophies. He wanted to prove he could still win somewhere else, under a different banner, with different people, in a different phase of his life. That is why the final RCR years matter. They were not the easiest years of his career. They were not the dominant years that fans remembered from his peak. But they revealed something important about him. Kyle Busch still wanted to fight. He still wanted to wrestle speed out of car. He still wanted to show that the old fire had not burned out. Even when the Cup wins became harder to find, the hunger remained visible. NASCAR's driver profile notes that his most recent Cup victory came in 2023 at Worldwide Technology Raceway, and that his 63 Cup wins ranked him 9th on the all-time wins list. Those numbers prove greatness, but the later struggle showed something just as revealing. He was not willing to disappear quietly. And then there was Brexton. Any story about Kyle Busch's final legacy has to come back to his son, because racing families do not simply pass down names, they pass down pressure. Brexton Busch had already been growing up inside the world of motorsports, watching his father not as a distant icon, but as a living blueprint. To millions of fans, Kyle was Rowdy, the controversial champion. To Brexton, he was Dad. That difference matters. Public legacy turns a person into highlights and records. Family legacy turns him into memory, habit, voice, instruction, and absence. That is why the image of the number 8 waiting in silence feels so powerful. In racing, numbers become emotional containers. They carry the memory of wins, sponsors, paint schemes, rivalries, and family stories. A number can become a brand, but it can also become a promise. For Kyle Busch, the 8 represented the final chapter of a restless career. For Brexton, it may one day represent inheritance. Not just the inheritance of fame, but the inheritance of expectation. If he ever carries that number forward, he will not only be driving a car. He'll be driving through the shadow of one of NASCAR's most complicated legends. And that is where the story becomes heavier than grief. Because Kyle Busch did not leave behind a simple legacy. He left behind admiration and argument, greatness and controversy, love and resentment, trophies and unfinished business. Some drivers are remembered cleanly. Kyle never was. He was too intense, too divisive, too alive in every room he entered. Even in death, people did not only mourn him, they debated him. That may sound harsh, but in a strange way, it proves how important he was. Only drivers who matter continue to create emotion after they are gone. The truth nobody was ready for is that Kyle Busch's death did not close the book. It opened a different one. A book about what NASCAR does with a legend who was never easy to love, but impossible to replace. A book about a family carrying private pain under public attention. A book about a young son growing up with a name that will follow him into every track, every interview, every comparison. And a book about a race team left to continue the season while one garage stall, one number, and one voice felt permanently missing. NASCAR did not just lose Kyle Busch. It lost one of its last true lightning rods. After his death, the sport still had races to run, points to count, sponsors to satisfy, and television windows to fill, but something inside the garage had changed. Busch was removed from the 2026 Cup Series point standings after his passing, a procedural decision that showed how quickly even a legend becomes part of the record book once the season moves forward. But emotionally, nothing about it felt procedural. Kyle had been an active full-time driver, and NASCAR's own tribute described him as a two-time Cup Series champion with 234 National Series wins, the most in NASCAR history. That kind of absence is not solved by replacing a name on an entry list. For years, Kyle Busch gave NASCAR conflict, and conflict is one of the secret engines of any sport. Fans need heroes, but they also need someone who makes them angry enough to keep watching. Kyle understood that role better than almost anyone. He never seemed desperate to be universally loved. In fact, part of his power came from the fact that he could win while being booed and still make the boos sound like proof that he mattered. He was not a polished product. He was not built to disappear into sponsor language. He was sharp, emotional, difficult, brilliant, and often impossible to manage. But that was exactly why NASCAR needed him. Without him, the garage felt cleaner, but also colder. The sport could find new winners. It could promote younger drivers. It could build new rivalries. But it could not manufacture another Kyle Busch overnight, because drivers like him are not created by marketing departments. They are created by years of pressure, resentment, talent, mistakes, dominance, and survival. His personality had history behind it. His anger had context. His confidence had numbers to support it. His arrogance, whether fans loved it or hated it, came from a resume few drivers could challenge. That is why the weeks after his passing felt like more than mourning. They felt like a reckoning. NASCAR had to confront what it had taken for granted. For years, Kyle had been treated as a permanent feature of the sport, almost like the walls, the pit road, or the sound of engines on Sunday afternoon. Even when he struggled, even when he was not winning every week, his presence gave the field weight. Beating Kyle Busch meant something. Angering Kyle Busch meant something. Passing Kyle Busch meant something. Losing to Kyle Busch definitely meant something. His name raised the temperature of any race. And then, suddenly, that temperature was gone. The tributes that followed were expected, but they were also complicated. Because Kyle Busch was not a simple figure, people could not mourn him in simple language. Calling him great was true, but incomplete. Calling him controversial was true, but too small. Calling him a champion was accurate, but it did not explain the strange emotional hold he had over NASCAR audiences. He was all of those things at once. A winner, a villain, a father, a teammate, a rival, a record setter, a man who could be harsh in defeat and unforgettable in victory. That complexity is what made his death feel so unresolved. Some athletes leave behind a clean legacy, polished by time and softened by nostalgia. Kyle Busch left behind a living argument. Where does he rank among the greatest? Was he underappreciated because fans disliked his personality? Did his intensity help him win, or did it cost him peace? Did NASCAR fully understand what it had while he was still here? These questions did not end with his death. If anything, they became louder. The medical details made the story even harder to process. Reporting based on his death certificate said Busch had dealt with pneumonia symptoms for days to weeks before the illness progressed into sepsis and fatal complications. That fact shifted the conversation from racing legacy to human vulnerability. Fans were forced to look at a champion not as a machine, but as a man whose final threat did not come from another car, another driver, or another track. It came from illness, from something internal, quiet, and brutally fast once it turned severe. That is the truth NASCAR was not ready for. The sport prepares for crashes. It prepares for rain delays, rule controversies, angry fans, broken parts, and championship heartbreak. But it was not prepared for Kyle Busch to vanish this way. Not while he was still active. Not while his son Brexton was still growing inside the racing world. Not while the number 8 still carried unfinished meaning. And now the sport has to move forward with a missing voice. The races will continue. The engines will start. New drivers will win. New villains will appear. New stories will be written. But every time NASCAR needs someone fearless enough to be hated, talented enough to be respected, and stubborn enough to make the whole garage react, people will remember why Kyle Busch mattered. Because he did not just race in NASCAR. He disturbed it. He challenged it. He made it louder. And when he was gone, the silence proved how much noise he had been carrying. In the end, Kyle Busch's story was never just about winning. It was about what a man becomes when winning is the only language the world allows him to speak. For more than 20 years, Kyle lived inside noise. Engines, booze, radios, interviews, rivalries, restarts, crashes, trophies, criticism, and pressure. He was called difficult, brilliant, arrogant, fearless, immature, misunderstood, and legendary, sometimes all in the same weekend. But after his sudden death on May 21st, 2026, following severe pneumonia that progressed into sepsis, all that noise collapsed into one painful question. Did people truly understand the man behind the myth before it was too late? That is the truth nobody was ready for. Kyle Busch was not invincible. He only looked that way because racing had trained everyone to see him through speed. Fans saw the driver who won 63 Cup races, captured 2 Cup Series championships, and became NASCAR's all-time National Series wins leader. They saw the villain, the champion, the record breaker, the driver who could make a crowd angry just by taking the lead. But in his final chapter, the sport was forced to see something else. Kyle Busch was human. And sometimes the body gives its final warning quietly, long before the world understands what is happening. His legacy will not be clean because Kyle Busch was never clean. He was complicated. He was not designed to be universally loved. He said things people hated. He raced in ways people questioned. He celebrated with an edge that made some fans furious. But the same fire that made him controversial also made him unforgettable. NASCAR does not remember Kyle Busch because he was easy. NASCAR remembers him because he mattered. Every time he entered a race, the emotional stakes changed. If he won, people reacted. If he lost, people reacted. If he spoke, people listened, even when they claimed they did not want to. That kind of presence cannot be manufactured. It cannot be replaced by a marketing campaign or a young driver with a polished media smile. Kyle Busch came from an older kind of racing energy where talent and temper often lived in the same body. He gave NASCAR friction, and friction creates heat. Without him, the sport may still move forward, but it moves forward with one less spark, one less disruptor, one less driver who could make Sunday afternoon feel personal. And then there's Brexton. For fans, Kyle leaves behind highlights. For his family, he leaves behind absence. That is the part no tribute video can fully capture. A sport can honor a number. A team can preserve a car. Fans can post memories. Broadcasters can replay victories. But a son loses something far deeper than a champion. He loses the voice that was supposed to guide him, the hand on his shoulder, the father who understood both the beauty and danger of chasing a racing dream. Kyle Busch's greatest unfinished story may not be a race he never won. It may be the years he will not get to spend watching his son become his own man. That is why the final image of Kyle Busch should not only be a race car crossing the line. It should also be the silence after the engine shuts off, because that silence tells the real story. It tells us that fame is temporary, records are fragile, and even the loudest lives can end in a moment no one expected. Kyle Busch spent his career trying to outrun everyone. In the end, he left behind something speed cannot measure: impact. The truth nobody was ready for is that Kyle Busch's final days did not shrink his legend. They changed the way people understood it. He was not just a driver fans loved to hate. He was not just a champion who refused to soften. He was a man who gave everything to a sport that demanded everything back. And when he was gone, NASCAR discovered that even its most controversial figures can become irreplaceable. Kyle Busch did not leave quietly because his life was quiet. He left behind arguments, memories, grief, admiration, and unfinished questions. And maybe that is the only ending that ever made sense for him. Not perfect, not simple, not peaceful in the way fans might want, but powerful. Because legends like Kyle Busch do not disappear when the final lap ends. They stay in the sound of every restart, every angry crowd, every fearless pass, and every young driver who learns that greatness always comes with a cost.